Hi, and welcome to your first lecture for Bio 101. Our lecture will be based off of your textbook, Biology, A Guide to the Natural World by David Crow, 5th edition. And we'll start out here in week 1 with Chapter 1, and the title of Chapter 1 is Science as a Way of Learning. In this chapter, there are 4 different sections plus an essay. 1.1, How does science impact the everyday world? Then we'll move on to 1.2, what is science? 1.3, the nature of biology, and 1.4, special qualities of biology. And the essay is on the process of science. Before we get started with our discussion for this chapter on science and biology and studying science, let's just go over briefly here what is science. And science is a body of knowledge. So it's something that we can study and gather data on. Science can also be defined as a way of learning or a process of coming to understand the natural world through observations and testing of some idea that we call a hypothesis through experiments. Seems a little bit complicated. We'll go into that all throughout the rest of this chapter. But essentially, science is a way of studying something that we've agreed is a valid way to study it. And it's just that collection of all that information that we've studied. Despite our huge changes and improvements in our knowledge of science and our knowledge of technology over the last several centuries, the American today has at best an uneven knowledge of science. So we've had huge changes in what we know and understand, but science is really such a broad field that no one ever will know everything in science. There's always new things that we're figuring out. And science is constantly changing, so no one really ever could know everything. So even if you read everything and understood everything today on every subject, if you were somehow able to, things are changing daily on our understanding in science. And so somewhat the exciting thing about science is it is always changing, and there are always new things being learned, new technological innovations, and new ways that can help us and change our daily lives. So it's kind of a fun fact that almost 80% of adult Americans who were surveyed recently know that the continents are moving about on the face of the earth. But of those surveyed, 25% of those people think that the sun goes around the earth. And just in case you didn't know, the earth and all the planets orbit around the sun. So even though we use phrases in our everyday discussions like the sun is coming up and the sun is going down, because it looks like that and it makes sense to say it that way, the sun really doesn't go up and down. We just are constantly turning and moving away from the sun. So our goal for this chapter is really to understand what science is. So to look at that, we'll look at the scientific method and how science is done and how scientific method helps us learn things in science. And then we'll also look at a basic understanding of what biology is and how that fits into the realm of science. First, 1.1, how does science impact the everyday world? So science plays an increasingly important role in the lives of Americans and in a lot of people around the world. Most of that change that impacts us falls under the category of technology, and most all technological innovations have their roots in science. As an example of how technology has changed our lives, until the mid-1990s, most Americans did not use email, have cell phones, or have the internet. And now, a few decades later, you can see how incredibly prevalent that is in your lives. So some technological changes have make huge impacts on our lives, and others develop a little more slowly over time. But technology definitely has the ability to drastically change our everyday lives. So just for a visual of how computers have changed from your parents' or grandparents' era, depending on how old you are, in the mid-1900s to today, you can see the picture on the left and right. This is from figure 1.1 in your text. The figure on the left shows a 1948 computer called Baby. It was 6 feet tall, 16 feet wide, and had 128 bytes of memory. So most of the time nowadays we are at least talking gigabytes in terms of storage, but that was 128 bytes of memory. The MSI touchscreen on the right was from 2010. It was 2 feet across, 3 inches thick, and had 640 billion bytes of memory. The change in technology from just a couple generations ago till now, and what that technology, just in terms of computers, has done for us is huge. Another example of a change in technology, so we talked about computers. DNA has been a huge change recently in the last 100 years or so, a little less than 100 years. So in 1953, DNA was first described by James Watson and Francis Crick. It wasn't until 1978, so about 25 years later, that the first genetically engineered medicine, human insulin, was developed. So DNA is the stuff inside of all of our cells. It's the instructions that tell our cells what to do. Genetically engineered means you're making a change to that something in your DNA. And so it took them 25 years from discovering it to figure out how to use that information to make something that a medicine that was helpful to humans. And one important thing to know about science that your textbook talks about in this chapter is that science will present people with options. So science can find information, it can find out how to do things, but then people, businesses, government decide whether that's something that we should go ahead and do. So people decide if the government approves it and says it can be done. Businesses can decide whether they want to go on with that technology or make that medicine, and people decide whether they want to use those certain things, whether to eat food that's been modified, whether to take medicines that or get vaccines. So your book goes into a lot of things like stem cells. They figured out how to use stem cells that were discarded by fertility clinics, used in the treatment, used to treat spinal cord injuries and Parkinson's disease. And so that's kind of a contentious issue on should you allow those stem cells, because there's definitely people that feel very strongly that those are human life and don't think that that's appropriate. And then there's other people that would say that this is a life-changing technology for people. So that's something that people really have to work through on whether these issues, even if we can do them, are they ethical and should we do them? For example, should you allow humans to be cloned? We've started cloning other mammals. Would that be something that would be ethical to be done? A big issue that comes up, are vaccines safe? So one study gets published saying they're not safe, and the first study really wasn't based scientifically on a whole lot, but it really got people thinking about that issue. And of course, we all want to give our kids the best possible options in life, and so that becomes an issue that then parents are making on whether they want to give their children vaccines that can prevent them from getting some really horrible diseases. But that definitely has become an issue in the last few decades. Another example is, should we thin forests to reduce the risk of wildfires? So I think the pendulum swings back and forth on from thinking that we should leave forests, thinking that we should do thinning, to then going we need to leave forests alone and let the species that live in those forests not be bothered, and allow old growth forests. And then the pendulum will swing to the other end of that we have a bad group of fires and that we need to thin out those fires to reduce risk. So we're trying to weigh the risks and benefits, really any group that's making decisions on the good and the bad of things and whether they should be done. So once again, the main takeaway point here is that science will present people with options, but then society at large, or people individually, have to decide whether they approve of those options. One really important unifying concept in science is that all science uses something called the scientific method in order to test something and see if it is a valid scientific idea. So no matter what the idea is, it has to go through these steps of the scientific method in order to be tested and to get information about that idea. And it's a really useful feature of science, and it's what helps separate science from some other other ideas and that aren't testable. So anything that's going to be classified as science has to be something that we can test. And the steps that we go about using to test this process is the scientific method. And the 5 steps of the scientific method, which you may see differently in different textbooks, but they all kind of generally follow the same idea, is that you make an observation, you ask a question about that observation, you come up with a hypothesis or a possible answer to that question, you do an experiment to test your hypothesis, and then you come up with a conclusion. And so if you look at the figure on the right, that's figure 1.3 from your text, you can see this person here is apparently making an observation. To me, it looks like she is saying that, making the observation that I have a headache, or she thinks really, really hard about things. But let's just say that she's making the observation that I have a headache. The next step, if she wanted to go through the scientific method to find out why she has a headache, would be to ask a question. So one possible answer that she could say in the scenario would be, why do I have a headache? And you've probably gone through this version of the scientific method before, I'm guessing, in your own lives. But so she has the observation, I have a headache. She asks the question, why do I have a headache? In order to test this, you have to come up with an idea of why you think you might have a headache, so you have something to test. So although there could be a lot of reasons she has a headache, let's say she comes up with a hypothesis that I think I might have a headache because I have not been drinking enough water. So then she designs an experiment. And this is not really a great example of the scientific method because usually you don't do it on yourself. But just for our example here, she comes up with an experiment to test if her headache is possibly due from not drinking enough water. And so she says, in my experiment, I have a headache right now. I'm going to try drinking 3 large glasses of water and see what my headache is like in an hour. So she drinks 3 large glasses of water and her headache goes away. She comes up with the conclusion that my headache might have been, that my hypothesis was supported. So her headache may have been caused by a lack of having enough water, being dehydrated. Now, some important things to keep in mind in science are that we do not prove our hypothesis. So by drinking water and seeing her headache go away, she did not prove that her headache was caused by being dehydrated. That data that she collected supports the idea that her headache was caused by a lack of water, but it is entirely possible that her headache was caused by her being too hot or too cold or many other reasons that just maybe she was tired and she happened to rest during the time that she drank the water. So there could be a lot of causes to the headache. And so she's not proving that her headache was caused by being dehydrated, but this particular experiment supports the idea that her headache was caused from being dehydrated. And one important concept in science in general that seems really odd is that, when you just think about it, is that we do not ever prove anything in science. So any idea can be supported by a certain amount of data, and the more data that we have, then the better we consider that scientific concept. So let's go over those ideas one more time. Any idea being tested by science is called a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a possible answer to a question. It has to be something that can be tested. It has to be something that can be proven wrong, not right. And as odd as it seems, we can't prove things right in science. We can prove them wrong. We can have a large amount of data to support it. But there could always be new data that comes along that proves it wrong at some point. When we have an idea that's supported by a large amount of data, we call that a theory. A theory in science is not the same as our everyday use of the word. We tend to use theory as, oh, someone had a theory, which could just mean they had a crazy idea, some idea that they had. If we use the word theory in science, that means that it's something that has been tested over and over and over again, and repeatedly has had evidence supporting that idea. Again, not proving it right, but no one has as of yet proved it wrong. So if we call something a theory, that means that at that current time, that appears to be what's happening, although it could always be proven wrong at some point. So let's go over an example of a theory. One common example we've probably all heard of is the Big Bang Theory. And this is the most popular theory, meaning that it's the theory that most scientists and people feel is probably what happened and how our universe sort of got created and how our universe is changing. So it's the most popular idea, I say scientifically speaking, because you can get into a whole nother realm, religiously speaking, of how our universe was created. But that's not something that we can test. And so in terms of what we can test, the Big Bang Theory is the idea that all of the current and past matter in the universe came into existence at the same time, roughly 13.8 billion years ago. Before that time, it's kind of hard to comprehend, but in this theory, before that time, space and even time did not exist. So it wasn't that suddenly there was a ball of matter within space that started expanding. There was not space before that point, and there was not time before that point. And so at that time, when all matter was suddenly came into existence and time came into existence, that matter was compacted into a very small ball with infinite density and intense heat. And suddenly this ball started to inflate at an exponential rate, and the universe as we know it began. Some of this sounds almost hard to believe, but if you were to take a lot of really in-depth physics courses, you could see a lot of data that support this idea. We can see that our universe is expanding, and we can see that the further out you go in the universe, the faster it's expanding. And so there is a ton of data to support this. So one of the main people who in the 70s worked on doing all of these calculations to support this theory was Stephen Hawking. And he had a ton of data, mathematical data supporting this theory. Toward the end of his life, however, he changed his mind about part of his theory and didn't think that the universe will expand indefinitely, as most people had thought with this theory. He thinks it will reach a point where it will eventually reach maximum expansion and collapse in on itself. And so this is just one example of how theories do change over time. Theories are constantly, it is certainly possible in 10 years that someone will come up with data that shows that this is all completely wrong and that we didn't understand it. But at the current time, a theory is something that is explained by the current data and that hasn't as of yet been proven wrong. So the Big Bang Theory is pretty mathematically and scientifically very complex and hard for us to see the experiments that are being done at this level. So let's go to some experiments that were done a couple hundred years ago and can help us see a little more simply how the scientific method is used to disprove an idea. So in the 1800s, there was this idea that persisted that living things could spontaneously appear from non-living material. And this was based on observations people made that seemed logical at the time. For example, that if you put out a piece of meat, that maggots would appear on it and flies would develop from those maggots. And so they thought that these maggots just appeared in the meat. They weren't from anything, they just appeared and flies grew. They also would see mice in packages of cheese that they had in their cellar and think that mice could spontaneously appear from cheese. So this was just a common theory at that time. To us now, we know this can't occur, so it seems a little bit odd, but that was what they thought at the time. This idea was called spontaneous generation. So there was a French scientist in the mid-1800s named Louis Pasteur who wanted to prove that germs, which we now know as bacteria, but then were unknown and unseen. He wanted to prove that that people would get sick from germs from person-to-person contact, and that you didn't just spontaneously get germs in your body. this idea was really hard to prove as long as the idea of spontaneous generation appeared. So at this point, people thought that any kind of microorganisms, if there is such a thing as bacteria, just appeared in people, and they didn't come from person-to-person contact. So the experiment on the right is an experiment done by someone else that showed with flies that if you put them in a bottle and you corked the bottle, maggots, and you had a piece of meat in there, maggots did not grow in it no matter how long you left it in there. People argued, though, that maybe they're not growing in there because they need air, and so he designed another experiment where he put cheesecloth over it that allowed air in, but nothing else to get in, and flies and maggots developed on top of the cheesecloth, but not in the meat. So this sort of disproved spontaneous generation for larger organisms, but Pasteur needed to disprove spontaneous generation altogether in order to say that illness and microorganisms are transferred from person to person. So he came up with a test using the scientific method to try to disprove the idea of spontaneous generation altogether. So his observation that he made was if you have a sterile flask that's been boiled and you put in it sterile broth, so like chicken broth, let's say, you put in sterile broth, what he observed was that new material will grow in the broth. So it will start getting cloudy and it will start to appear as if something is growing inside of it. And his question then was, what is the source of the living material? Now, spontaneous generation would say that that the living material is derived from non-living material, that it just spontaneously appears in the broth. That is the first hypothesis or possible answer. It was not the one that he thought of. The one that he thought is that the living material is derived from living material outside the flask, so that little microorganisms, as we now would say, fall into the flask and contaminate it and start growing in the broth. And so he designed an experiment where he took a sterile flask and he put a curve in it that was meant to act as a particle trap. He took a sterile flask, he put sterile broth inside of it, and the idea of the particle trap is that if any organisms from outside were in fact coming in, that they would fall down here, but they would stay right here, those microorganisms, and they wouldn't be able to get readily up and over and into the broth. So he started his experiment by putting sterile broth inside the particle trap, and he noticed that there was no growth inside the flask. So unlike before, where there was just kind of a straight open flask that grew something in it, this curved particle trap flask did not have any growth in it. So what he did next was he removed the trap, and when he removed the trap, he noticed that there was then growth inside of the flask, and he also tipped the flask to mix the trapped dust that had fallen down into this particle trap in with the broth, and then tipped it right side up again, and he noticed that he also got growth. So no growth at this point right here rejected the idea of spontaneous generation. So it rejected that hypothesis. We can't prove his hypothesis true, but we rejected the old hypothesis of spontaneous generation. So let's just review again the steps of the scientific method and Louis Pasteur's experiment that he did on spontaneous generation. So he first made an observation about that things tend to grow inside sterile bone broth in a flask. He asked a question: what is the source of living material? He came up with a hypothesis. This was the old hypothesis. His new hypothesis stated that the living material came from outside the flask and fell into it. He designed an experiment to test that. So this was his experiment he did here. And then he came up with a conclusion that there is no such thing as spontaneous generation, and was able to reject the spontaneous generation hypothesis. So I've mentioned that scientific claims must be falsifiable. That means that there is the ability to prove them false. If you can't prove it false, it's not considered a valid scientific inquiry. So on that same note, scientific inquiry is limited to investigating natural as opposed to supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. So it's not to say that a supernatural explanation couldn't exist, but that it does not fall under the realm of science because we can't disprove it. In section 1.3 in your text starts going into what exactly is biology, our topic for this course. And biology is the study of life. Life is defined by a group of 8 characteristics that are possessed by all living things. We're going to study biology, the study of life. We need to know what makes something alive, and this can be somewhat hard to pin down, but the characteristics that they found that all living things have is that they have a way to assimilate or get energy and use energy. Living things in one way or another will respond to their environment. They will maintain a relatively constant internal environment, so they'll keep relatively the same pH, water balance, relatively the same temperature. Things can change temperature a bit, but most of their internal features stay relatively constant. Living things have to have a way of being able to reproduce themselves. They possess a set of information encoded in their DNA that allows them to function. So all living things have what we call DNA. All living things are composed of one or more cells. All living things evolved from other living things. So all living things that we see came from some other living thing. And living things are very highly organized compared to inanimate objects. So a living organism is much more complex and very highly organized compared to something that's not living, like let's say a rock. Life is organized into this hierarchical manner, which means that we can break something down from a whole organism that's extremely complex into component parts. And so the basic part that we have making up living things are what we call atoms, or the basic elements in something. So whether you have oxygen in you or hydrogen or carbon, it's those atoms that make you up. Atoms are combined to form molecules. So you have water in your body that's combined of hydrogen and oxygen put together. That's called a molecule. All the different molecules work together to form organelles, or parts of a cell. Organelles all work together to make a functioning cell that can do a specific job. Cells work together to make tissues like muscle tissue or skin tissue. Those tissues work together to form organs, and those form organ systems, and those form the entire organism. Groups of organisms make up a population. Populations make up communities. And then the next broader category is ecosystem, and then we have our biosphere, and you could move on to the universe. So there are these categories that we can talk about life in, from its most simple parts to the very complex parts. Up until the early 19th century, biology was largely descriptive, a descriptive science that's main goal was to catalog and describe Earth's living things. So Charles Darwin, you probably know him for the theory of evolution, but he was a naturalist who spent most of his life describing and cataloging species from around the world. So going on these trips and looking at species and cataloging them, writing about them in books. And this is a picture of him describing some different fish species. But that was the main thing that biology focused on. It wasn't so much using biology as we use it now for technology, but just describing and documenting what living things were out there and what they look like. Biology subject matter, the living world, is notable for its complexity and diversity compared to other aspects of the natural world, such as stars and atoms. So living things, again, as we mentioned before, all their complex parts, living things are very complex. Biology doesn't deal with universal rules to the extent that a discipline such as physics does. So physics is very focused on rules that apply to how all matter interacts, but biological research may focus on a particular species, a process, or portions of the living world. So they're looking more at how certain components work in a living thing as opposed to how these laws of the universe, like physics, would. Biology's one of its chief unifying principles is evolution, which is the idea that, or the theory that can be defined as the gradual modification or change of populations of living things over time. This modification sometimes results in the development of a new species. So it's the idea that that things change over time. Populations change over time, and those changes in populations lead to changes in organisms. So evolution helps us understand how things on Earth have gone from, if you look at the fossils from a long, long time ago, from relatively simple organisms on Earth to the variety of species that we've seen in the fossils over time to the variety and huge complexity of Earth that we, living things on Earth that we see today. So evolution occurs through a process called natural selection. And natural selection is simply stating that the organisms who are best in a group of species who are best adapted to the environment are the ones who are going to survive. So if you look at, say you go back a long time ago and you see the giraffes from a long, long time ago of a variety of heights. Well, if the environment they lived in had tall trees where most of the vegetation was up high, the giraffes with the longest necks are going to be the ones that are most likely to survive. So these shorter ones, if they can't get food, they're going to be more likely to die off. So over time, what that means is that you'll see giraffes with the longest necks surviving. And that shows how, just a simplified version of how a population can change over time. And this change in a population over time is what we call evolution. We are at the end of our Chapter 1 lecture. Before I let you go, I just want to go over a little bit on each chapter. There tend to be one or more what they call essays, and these are the sections in your chapter that sort of have a purplish gray background, and your discussions each week will be based on these essays. So I'm not going to cover the information in the essay in the lecture. I'm going to let you read about that on your own and then discuss it in the discussion each week. So this week your discussion is based on introducing yourself to the class. Next week you will be discussing the Chapter 1 essay called The Process of Science, How Science and Business Take on Cancer. And so there's some things that you'll look at in this essay and answer some questions for the discussion. And I have instructions for that in the week 2 discussion link, but just to give you a heads up that I'm not talking about that essay in this lecture, but you'll still read that essay and you still may have test questions on that essay, but that information will be covered in your discussion. And that's the end of our week 1 lecture. Before I let you go, I just want to remind you to please go, if you have not done that yet, take your syllabus quiz. Make sure you establish your attendance in this course, and then you can go through the week 1 module for the lecture of your other assignments for this week. As I've mentioned, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with me either by text or email, and I'll be happy to help you out with anything you need help with in this first week of getting started. It's great to have you in class, and I will be in touch with you again in week 2.